It is said that one evening in the city of Córdoba long ago, when the lamps glimmered faintly along the streets and the air was filled with the faint fragrance of jasmine, a woman walked unveiled, her robe of white silk embroidered with verses of her own composing. To the eyes of those who watched, she was no ordinary woman but Wallada, daughter of a disgraced caliph, a princess who had chosen not silence but speech, not concealment but revelation. Her steps caused whispers to rise like startled birds. Her robe did not only cover her but proclaimed her, words stitched in gold declaring her defiance of the age. Some murmured of scandal, others of admiration, but none who saw her forgot. Greetings, travelers of memory. As you listen to this tale, perhaps you might tell me in the quiet comments below from where and at what hour you keep company with these words, so that across distance and time we may weave a network of remembrance. And if you wish this circle of shared histories to continue, then press the hand of subscription that we may walk again together. The tale begins not with the woman unveiled in the streets, but with a child enclosed within the high walls of the Cordoban palace. Imagine, if you will, the air of that place in the early years of the 11th century. Córdoba, jewel of al-Andalus, was at once a city of immense richness and of deepening fractures. The palaces, with their carved arches and perfumed gardens, still echoed with the grandeur of the Umayyad caliphs, but within those marble halls the weight of decline was already pressing. In such a palace was born Wallada bint al-Mustakfi, daughter of Muhammad III, whose hand briefly held the caliphal authority, but whose reign would end in shame. It was here that her childhood unfolded, beneath ceilings inlaid with cedar and ivory, yet shadowed always by the murmurs of betrayal. What was it like to be a young girl in such a place? One imagines the marble floors cool beneath bare feet, the whisper of attendants moving with lowered eyes, the scent of orange trees drifting through lattice windows. She would have been taught the art of letters, for in Córdoba, learning was a treasure as prized as jewels. She would have heard recitations of poetry, verses flowing like water from the lips of court poets. And yet she must have also sensed the tremor beneath the gilded calm, the uneasy glances exchanged by servants, the sudden silences when men of politics entered the rooms. For though a palace shelters, it does not conceal from a child the truth that power is fragile. Her father, Muhammad III, was a caliph in name, but not in secure authority. He ascended the throne during a period of chaos when the great caliphate of Córdoba, once a beacon of unity in the western lands of Islam, was crumbling into pieces. Court intrigues multiplied like weeds in an abandoned garden, and loyalty shifted with each change of fortune. To be his daughter was to inherit not only the memory of grandeur, but also the stain of instability. Perhaps Wallada as a child watched her father return from councils with a heavy brow. Perhaps she heard raised voices echoing in distant chambers. What seed of defiance was planted in her then, as she realized that to be a princess was not to be secure, but to stand always on the edge of downfall? Yet in childhood there are also moments of quiet delight. One imagines Wallada's hand tracing letters on parchment, the ink glistening dark under lamplight. Perhaps she composed her first tentative verses while still a girl, verses hidden at first, whispered to herself in the privacy of her chamber. The traditions of her people offered women lives largely veiled and enclosed, but Córdoba was a city of poets, and poetry seeps even into the spaces where silence is expected. Did she dream then of a life not bounded by walls, of words set free like birds into the air? Or did she merely imitate what she heard, until one day her own voice surprised her with its sharpness? It is easy, when we look back across centuries, to see the great woman already present in the child. But life is more uncertain than memory suggests. Perhaps she was quiet, perhaps she was restless, perhaps she loved the gardens more than the halls. What we do know is that her childhood was brief in its peace, for the collapse of her father's reign came swiftly, bringing disgrace and exile, and in that collapse, we may glimpse the shaping of her spirit. For a child who has seen luxury vanish, who has known the silence of attendants when disaster strikes, is a child who may one day choose to live without fear of scandal. If the world has already stripped you of innocence, what is left to guard but your own voice? I imagine her standing by a lattice window, watching the streets of Córdoba, hearing the distant sound of water running through fountains. Perhaps she saw the people of the city moving in their ordinary lives, unaware of the anxieties within the palace walls. Perhaps she longed to be among them, not as a hidden princess, but as a being free to speak and to walk unveiled. Did the seed of rebellion stir already then, even before her father fell? We cannot say, yet the silence of those years speaks as much as the poems of her later life. In the quiet of childhood, the world was already giving her its first lessons in loss and in defiance. The air within the palace grew heavy as her father's reign weakened. Whispers of treachery, plots of nobles, soldiers turning their loyalty, these were not things a child could ignore. And when at last the palace gates closed upon the downfall of Muhammad III, when his power ended in disgrace, Wallada's life altered forever. The child of privilege became the daughter of a fallen man. What does that do to the heart of a girl? Does it leave her broken, or does it free her from illusions? Perhaps it was then she first resolved never to let shame silence her, to wear her words openly where others would hide them. And so the image remains, a child within a palace, the air scented with orange blossoms, the marble floors cold, the voices of adults filled with unease. She is learning to write. She is learning to listen. She is learning that power falters and silence imprisons. Her life, though still in its beginnings, is already marked by both beauty and fragility. And as night falls over Córdoba, the palace gates close with a heavy sound, echoing down the corridors like the toll of fate. And the child, Wallada, listens, though she does not yet understand what those closing gates foretell. The palace gates had closed, heavy and final, shutting out the last illusion of safety. Within the halls, cloth of mourning was spread, black against marble that once shone with gold light. The daughter of the caliph was still only a young girl, but she could not escape the shadow of her father's disgrace. Muhammad III, once seated on the throne of Córdoba, had fallen, dethroned by enemies who wore the faces of allies. His death soon followed, not on the battlefield where a caliph might dream of falling, but in confinement, whispered by some to have been poisoned, by others to have been left to wither under the slow hand of despair. What truth can we seize from so many centuries away? Perhaps none. We can only imagine the silence that settled over the palace as news spread, a silence thick with grief and with shame. In those days, the fate of a ruler's household was tied to the shifting fortunes of power. A caliph fallen was not merely one man disgraced, but an entire family cast into uncertainty. For the young Wallada, the death of her father was not only the loss of a parent, but the loss of protection, status, and security. To be the daughter of a disgraced man was a kind of exile, even if she remained in Córdoba. The people of the city would look at her with eyes that remembered scandal, and scandal, once tasted by a child, shapes the soul more deeply than praise. Was it then that she first tasted the bitterness that would sharpen her verses? Was it then that she learned that the world would never forgive, that it was better to embrace defiance than to seek pardon? Imagine her walking through rooms now dim, the curtains drawn, the attendants moving like shadows, their heads lowered. The voices of poets and musicians were hushed, laughter no longer echoed in the courtyards. Where once there had been music at night, there was now the long keening of grief. One sees her perhaps seated beside her mother, the two of them wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly of dye, their faces pale against the darkness. Did she weep openly? Or did she, even then, swallow her tears, preferring to carry her pain in silence? A child forced too early into sorrow sometimes learns to hide her wounds behind a proud gaze. Córdoba beyond the palace gates continued its life, yet even the city was not untouched by decline. The great caliphate was splintering. Rival factions carved away its power. The streets carried the sounds of argument, of markets that thrived while politics faltered, of men debating loudly in taverns, and of scholars still reciting under the arches of mosques. But within the mourning palace, time seemed suspended. Wallada's father had been caliph, and now he was gone, and she was left to inherit not authority but the weight of his memory. That memory was heavy with contradiction. He had been both ruler and failure, both figure of reverence and object of ridicule. Such a father leaves his daughter with no simple legacy. She might honor him, she might resent him, she might both honor and resent him in the same breath. Perhaps it was this contradiction that nurtured in her the fierce independence that would later astonish her world. What does it mean for a young girl to lose her father in scandal? To some, it would mean retreat, a life of silence, of accepting the veil not only over the face but over the voice. Yet Wallada would not follow that path. She was mourning, yes, but in mourning she was also watching. She was watching how men's power rises and falls, how reputations vanish overnight, how loyalty bends like reeds before the wind. And perhaps she was already asking herself, if the world is so fickle, why not live as one chooses rather than as one is commanded? Why should obedience be offered to a world that obeys nothing but its own shifting desires? There are stories told that she embroidered her own garments with her words, proud words of self-ownership, but those belonged to her later years. Yet even in this time of childhood mourning, the seed of such audacity may have been sown. She knew already that scandal could not destroy her. She had lived it in her father's fall. If she had survived disgrace as a child, why should she fear it as a woman? This thought may not have yet been conscious in her, but it lay like a stone at the bottom of a river, shaping the currents that flowed above. The silence of mourning cloth spread through every room. One sees the attendants moving with downcast eyes, the gardens neglected, fountains left untended so that moss grew along their edges. The bright silks were put away, replaced by coarse fabrics. The mirrors reflected pale faces. Wallada walked through these rooms, her steps small at first, then firmer, as she grew older within those mourning walls. She was watching, always watching. And though her father's body was gone, his shadow lingered, reminding her daily of both loss and defiance. A father who had been caliph, yet died in disgrace. What lesson does that teach his child? Perhaps that greatness is fleeting. Perhaps that power is unreliable, or perhaps, most dangerously, that one must create a greatness of one's own, not borrowed from any father or husband, but carved out by the force of words and presence. Outside, the people gossiped, for they always do. They spoke of Muhammad III's faults, of his indulgences, of his betrayals. They whispered of his daughter, left behind in shame. Some pitied her, some sneered, and yet she would remember their whispers, and she would one day answer them not with tears, but with poems so sharp that their memory would outlive the gossip of her father's enemies. In this way, mourning was not only sorrow, but also preparation, a long gestation of the poet-princess to come. And so the days passed, heavy with silence, heavy with loss. The mourning cloth remained, pressed against her skin, rough where once there had been smooth silk. Yet even mourning fades in time, though it leaves its mark. For a child, mourning is not an ending, but a beginning, a shaping of the heart. Wallada emerged from those years not broken but tempered, like iron in the forge. She would never forget the disgrace, but she would carry it as armor, not as chain. As the night drew over Córdoba, lamps dimmed in the palace. The corridors lay in shadow, the voices of attendants softened to whispers. The child Wallada, lying awake on her bedding, listened to the silence. Outside the walls, the city still moved, but within only mourning remained. And in the stillness of that night, a sound lingered, the faint whisper of silk being torn apart, a sound that would mark the transition from innocence to defiance, from daughter to woman, from silence to words that would one day scandalize and enthrall all of Córdoba. The whisper of silk torn apart lingers in the stillness, a sound delicate yet decisive, like the beginning of rebellion. From such a sound emerges the image of Wallada grown to womanhood, no longer the child of mourning, but the woman who would dare what others would not. In Córdoba, the custom was that women of noble blood lived within veils, their beauty guarded, their presence hidden, their words permitted only in the most private of chambers. But Wallada, daughter of a fallen caliph, had lived long enough with shame to understand that concealment offered no safety. If scandal followed her regardless, then why not shape scandal into her own banner? And so she did what few could imagine. She stepped into the streets unveiled, her hair uncovered, her face unhidden, her robe itself transformed into poetry. It was not merely that she appeared unveiled, it was the robe she wore, for on it were embroidered verses of her own composition, verses that declared with unflinching pride her freedom. On the right side, words shimmering in golden thread announced, "I am made for greatness, by God created to walk proudly." On the left, no less bold, "I allow my lover to kiss my cheek, and I grant my kiss to whomever I desire." In an age when women were expected to veil not only their faces, but also their voices, such words burned like fire against the cool silk. They were not whispered in secret corners, not hidden in scrolls passed hand to hand. They were stitched openly upon her garment, so that anyone who looked upon her would also read her defiance. Imagine the gasps that followed her through the streets. Men stopped in their steps, women murmured behind their hands, elders shook their heads. Some saw only scandal, others perhaps saw courage. For in a society where poetry was as essential as breath, she had chosen to wear poetry as skin. Was it an act of arrogance or of survival? Perhaps both. Perhaps she understood that in a world already determined to speak ill of her, she might as well speak herself, louder and more daringly than any gossip could. To be silent would be to vanish. To embroider her words upon her robe was to ensure she could not be ignored. What thoughts filled her heart as she walked unveiled? Was she afraid? Or did she walk with a calm, almost serene defiance, knowing that with each step she was rewriting the place of women in her society? We can never know. The chronicles speak only of the shock she caused, of the murmurs that rippled through Córdoba. But one may imagine the warmth of the sun upon her uncovered hair, the weight of the embroidered silk upon her shoulders, the feel of countless eyes upon her, and within her perhaps the steady fire of one who has chosen her path and will not turn back. There is a strange power in scandal. It destroys some, yet it grants others a freedom beyond convention. Wallada was among the latter. By stepping unveiled into the streets, she severed the cord that tied her to expectation. Once scandal had been embraced, she no longer needed to fear it. She had transformed disgrace into identity, shame into a kind of armor. If her father's memory was one of downfall, hers would be of defiance. And so she began her life not as the silent daughter of a caliph, but as a poet princess, whose body and words were both a declaration. The people of Córdoba could not cease speaking of her. She became both admired and ridiculed, celebrated and condemned. She was whispered about in markets, discussed in salons, debated in mosques, and yet, despite all the tongues that wagged, no one could erase her. Her presence had become indelible, stitched as surely into memory as her verses were stitched into silk. In this way, she achieved what few of her time could. She made herself impossible to silence. It is worth asking, was her unveiling only an act of defiance or also an act of longing? For what is scandal if not also a reaching toward freedom? Perhaps beneath her boldness was a simple desire to be seen as she was, not as the world demanded her to be. To walk unveiled was to claim her own body, her own voice, her own desires. The verses on her robe spoke not only of pride but of passion, of a woman who would love whom she chose without apology. Was this arrogance or was it honesty? The centuries do not answer but leave us to wonder. The murmurs spread like smoke through the city, curling through palaces and taverns alike. Some feared her influence, believing her boldness would lead others astray. Some admired her courage, even if they dared not say so aloud. Poets in particular were drawn to her, for they recognized in her a spirit as untamed as their own verses. They saw not only scandal, but the promise of a patroness, a hostess, a muse. And so, slowly, her house became a gathering place, a salon where poetry, music, and wit thrived, where men and women alike came to speak freely, unbound by the rigid forms of court. The scandal of her unveiling was thus transformed into the foundation of a new space, where freedom of word and thought could breathe. But before we speak of her salons, let us linger a little longer on that moment of unveiling, for it was not a single day's act, soon forgotten. It was a gesture that reverberated across her entire life. Once a woman has chosen to live unveiled in a world of veils, she cannot return to seclusion. Once a woman has worn her own words as her garment, she cannot hide them away. That first walk through the streets of Córdoba was the opening of a door, and Wallada would never close it again. Whether she walked in sunlight or in shadow, she would remain unveiled, her presence as bold as her poetry. And so the story of Wallada moves from silence into speech, from mourning into defiance. The torn silk of childhood has become the embroidered silk of womanhood. And with each step she takes, gasps follow, rising and falling like waves. She does not look back. She continues forward, her robe gleaming, her words shimmering in the sun, her life now bound not to concealment, but to declaration. And behind her, in the streets of Córdoba, the murmurs continue, spreading like smoke that drifts and never truly disappears. The gasps echo still, lingering in the air long after her steps have faded. And it is upon those astonished gasps that the next part of her life begins, for murmurs lead to whispers, and whispers to gatherings, and gatherings to the salons that would make her name resound through the ages. The murmurs spread like smoke, curling through the streets of Córdoba, entering markets and mosques, reaching the ears of poets and nobles alike. Smoke does not vanish. It lingers, it clings to walls. It carries the scent of fire long after the flames are gone. So too did the memory of Wallada's unveiled walk linger, and out of that lingering, a new space was born, a place where smoke turned to song, where murmurs became voices raised freely, where silence was banished. This was her house, her gathering place, her salon. Within those walls, the ordinary boundaries of gender and convention loosened, and poets, scholars, and lovers of art came together under her invitation. It was an audacity equal to her unveiling, to create not only a self of defiance, but a community that breathed her spirit of independence. Imagine the rooms of her house as the evening descended. Lamps were lit, their light warm against carved wood and patterned tiles. Cushions lay scattered across the floor, silks of many colors, faded perhaps but softened by use. the scent of burning lamps mixed with the fragrance of rosewater sprinkled upon the hands of guests. And above all was the sound, voices reciting verse, the plucking of strings, the low hum of debate. Men who in the wider city held positions of power came here to shed titles and speak as equals. Women who elsewhere were bound to silence here lifted their voices, and presiding over all was Wallada, unveiled, radiant, her gaze sharp and her tongue sharper still. She was not merely a hostess, but a sovereign of words, and her salon was her kingdom. How must it have felt to sit within that circle, knowing one was free to speak without fear of censure? Perhaps one heard a verse improvised on the spot, its rhythm carried by the clapping of hands, its meaning a mixture of wit and longing. Perhaps one felt the thrill of laughter ripple across the room as Wallada herself delivered a cutting line, her words striking like arrows yet leaving no blood, only astonishment. Those who came to her gatherings came not only for art, but for the taste of liberty, a taste rare in their world. It was intoxicating, it was dangerous, it was unforgettable. Some say that in these salons Wallada herself taught poetry, guiding younger voices, correcting their rhythms, sharpening their words. Others say she presided more as queen than as teacher, her mere presence enough to inspire. Whatever the truth, it is certain that her gatherings gave birth to poems that still echo today, verses woven from love, jealousy, and pride. Córdoba was a city alive with poetry already, but Wallada's salons made it a living fire, fed by both passion and scandal. For to enter her house was not only to enter a place of art, it was to risk being associated with her daring. And yet they came, drawn irresistibly as moths to flame. What does it mean for a woman in the 11th century to host such salons? It meant crossing boundaries thought immovable. It meant opening doors where others had closed them. It meant exposing herself daily to gossip, to slander, to accusation. And yet she did so, because perhaps she had already understood that to live half a life was not to live at all. She had embraced scandal in her unveiling. She would now embrace it in her gatherings. Better to be spoken of with shock than to be forgotten in silence. And so, night after night, her house filled with voices, with music, with the electricity of minds unchained. But let us pause and listen to the music that rose within her walls. A lute, its strings plucked gently, the notes lingering like drops of water falling into a still pool. A voice, soft yet steady, reciting a verse of love, of yearning, of betrayal. Then laughter, sudden and bright, scattering the solemnity like birds startled from their perch, and above all the figure of Wallada, her eyes alive with wit, her words flowing like the wine that some whispered was secretly poured despite prohibition. Her salon was not a place of rigid decorum, but of living humanity, where desire and art mingled freely. Some must have left trembling with excitement, others with unease, but all left changed. It is tempting to imagine that her salons were merely gatherings of pleasure, but they were more. They were acts of resistance against the narrowing of space for women, against the silencing of voices, against the suffocating grip of politics. In opening her home to poets and scholars, she claimed a power denied her in the palace of her childhood. She could not sit upon the caliphal throne, but she could preside over a throne of words, a realm where intellect and desire ruled. And in doing so, she ensured her immortality. For rulers are forgotten when their kingdoms fall, but poets are remembered as long as words are spoken. Still, the gossip did not cease. Some called her shameless, others immoral, others dangerous. Yet the very persistence of such words only deepened her legend. To be scandalous is to be remembered. To be forgotten is to be nothing. Wallada understood this truth better than most, and she wielded it with grace. She turned the sharpness of tongues into the sharpness of her own verses. She answered accusation not with apology but with poetry, and in poetry she always had the last word. As we sit with her in imagination, within that glowing room the night deepens. The lamps flicker, the lute strings vibrate. The voices grow softer, the laughter fades into gentle conversation. Outside, the city lies in darkness, its streets silent. But here, within Wallada's house, there is still warmth, still music, still life. One can almost hear the final trembling of strings, a single note hanging in the air long after the musician's hand has stilled. It is upon that lingering note that the gathering ends, the guests departing into the night, carrying with them the taste of freedom and the echo of scandal. The note continues, suspended, fragile, yet enduring, like a thread stretching into the next chapter of her life. For in the fading of music lies the promise of new voices, and among those voices soon to enter her circle is one that will change her life forever, a poet as brilliant as she and as reckless, Ibn Zaydun. The note lingered in the air, trembling still after the musician's hand had fallen silent, a single thread of sound stretching across the silence of the room. Such a note is fragile, and yet it binds together all who hear it, holding them for a breath in shared wonder. It was in such a silence, delicate and filled with possibility, that Wallada first encountered the man who would mark her life as deeply as any scar, as sweetly as any song. Abu al-Walid ibn Zaydun, the poet of Córdoba, the lover whose verses would entwine with hers in passion, in betrayal, and in immortal memory. He entered her circle as many poets did, drawn by the rumor of her salons, by the daring of her presence, by the promise of words spoken freely. Yet from the first glance, there was something more, something that bound them with the inevitability of flame-meeting dry wood. Imagine the scene. The lamps casting their soft glow across the cushions, the scent of rosewater still fresh in the air, the guests gathered in murmurs after the music had faded. Into this space, Ibn Zaydun stepped, his presence unmistakable. He was young still, though not untested. His reputation had begun to grow, his verses admired for their elegance and their passion. His eyes were keen, his bearing confident, his words ready to spill with the practiced grace of one who knew his gift. And Wallada, seated as hostess and queen of this circle, turned her gaze upon him. What passed between them in that gaze? We cannot know, but we may imagine the sudden recognition, the spark of kindred fire, the unspoken thought. Here is one who will match me word for word, passion for passion, scandal for scandal. He recited as poets did, perhaps at first with the flourish of one eager to impress. His voice carried through the room, the rhythm of his lines smooth as polished marble, his metaphors rich with longing. The guests listened, murmuring approval, but it was Wallada whose response mattered most, for she was the arbiter of this gathering. Did she smile faintly? Did her eyes sharpen with interest? Did she allow herself a rare moment of admiration? Whatever her outward expression, something stirred within her. Here was a man whose words could rival her own, whose boldness might stand beside her defiance. And perhaps within Ibn Zaydun, hearing her laughter, watching her unveiled face gleam in lamplight, there was the thought that he had found not only a patroness, but a muse, a lover, a rival in brilliance. In Córdoba, where poetry was currency as much as coin, their meeting was more than chance. It was the convergence of two forces destined to entwine. He, ambitious and brilliant, sought greatness through words and politics alike. She, bold and scandalous, sought freedom through verse and presence. Together they would ignite. The air of that salon, already rich with song, grew electric with the possibility of something new, something dangerous. Guests may have felt it, though they could not name it. The lingering note of the lute had become the opening chord of a love story that would echo across centuries. What is it that draws two souls together? Is it likeness or difference? In Ibn Zaydun, Wallada found one who could meet her on the battlefield of poetry, who could answer her wit with equal sharpness, her passion with equal fire. In Wallada, Ibn Zaydun found a woman unlike any other, a woman who lived unveiled, who dared to proclaim her own desires, who could inspire verses not only of adoration, but of awe. Was it love, or was it a recognition of mirrors, each seeing in the other the reflection of their own hunger for immortality? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps that is why their story burns so brightly in memory. It was never simple, never tame, but always alive with both devotion and rivalry. Their first conversations must have been charged with double meaning, each word testing, each glance a challenge. Did he recite a verse and watch her eyes to see if she approved? Did she answer with a verse of her own, slyly turning his metaphor upon him? Around them, the guests would have listened, sensing the undercurrent, the beginning of something greater than themselves. To witness the meeting of two such spirits was to witness history in the making, though none could yet foresee how sweet and how bitter the tale would become. As the night wore on, their words grew closer, their laughter softer, their voices overlapping in the cadence of poetry. It was as though the room itself dissolved, leaving only the two of them suspended in a web of verse. And perhaps, when the last guest had departed, when the lamps had dimmed, when silence returned to the house, each carried within them the knowledge that something irrevocable had begun. The spark had caught, and fire would follow. We cannot say for certain how quickly affection grew into passion, how swiftly admiration turned to desire. But in the poetry they left behind we find hints of their union, verses filled with longing, with tenderness, with the thrill of secret encounters. Ibn Zaydun would later write of her beauty, of the sweetness of her presence, of the agony of separation. Wallada would write of her love, but also of her anger, her scorn, her unyielding pride. Their poetry is not the record of a gentle romance, but of a storm that both nourished and destroyed. And yet, in this first meeting, all that lay ahead was still veiled in possibility, for now there was only the spark, only the laughter that overlapped like verses, only the voices that echoed long into the night. Outside, the streets of Córdoba lay quiet, the fountains whispered, the stars shone cold above. Within, two poets had found one another, and with their meeting, a story began that would outlast them both. The room was empty now, the lamps extinguished, but still one could hear in memory the echo of their voices, rising and falling in rhythm, weaving together into a single song. And as that song faded into silence, the scent of orange blossoms drifted through the window, carrying with it the sweetness of love's beginning, fragile, intoxicating, and destined to fall. The blossoms fall one by one, their petals scattering upon the stone floor, and it is in the falling of these petals that the next chapter begins, for the sweetness of love is always shadowed by the silence of its withering. The petals of orange blossoms drifted down, pale against the dark stone, their fragrance lingering in the air even as their fragile bodies withered beneath passing feet. Love is much like such blossoms, sudden in its flowering, intoxicating in its scent, and yet always shadowed by the knowledge of its fragility. In those days when Wallada and Ibn Zaydun first drew near, love blossomed as if a garden had burst into bloom within the walls of Córdoba. Their union, whispered of in every corner of the city, was not hidden in secrecy, though its meetings may have been. It was proclaimed in verse, celebrated in lines that carried both sweetness and fire. For two poets in love cannot help but make their passion into poetry, and their poetry cannot help but travel into the ears of others. Their encounters were perhaps held in hidden gardens, where the sound of water from fountains mingled with the murmur of voices, where the moonlight lay silver upon marble, where orange blossoms opened their fragrance into the night. One imagines them seated together, words flowing more swiftly than the stream beside them, verses composed and answered, laughter mingled with tenderness. For a time, rivalry gave way to harmony, and wit softened into affection. She, who had so boldly proclaimed her independence, allowed herself the sweetness of companionship, and he, ambitious and often restless, found in her not only a lover, but a muse. To write for Wallada was to write for immortality, for her response, her gaze, her voice were the truest measure of greatness. What words passed between them in those hours? Perhaps lines of longing, metaphors of gardens, of flames, of stars. Perhaps confessions too intimate to be written, only spoken in the hush of night. And yet the poems that survive give us glimpses, fragments of their passion. Ibn Zaydun would later write verses that speak of union remembered, of kisses shared, of embraces that lingered in his heart long after they had ended. Wallada, too, left lines that suggest tenderness before betrayal darkened them. For a time, they were bound in sweetness, their love as fragrant and ephemeral as the blossoms that fell upon their shoulders. But even in their intimacy, there was always the presence of pride. Wallada was no ordinary beloved, no silent muse waiting to be praised. She was herself a poet, herself a presence of brilliance, herself a flame. She would not be reduced to ornament, and Ibn Zaydun, whose ambition stretched beyond poetry into the realm of politics and power, was not a man to rest in the shadow of another's brilliance. Their love was a union of equals, and equality is never without friction. Yet perhaps it was precisely this that made their passion so vivid. For what is love without a measure of challenge, without the tension of two spirits who both refuse to bow? Their verses dance between devotion and rivalry, each line an embrace, each line a contest. The city spoke of them. In markets, in palaces, in taverns, their names were linked together. Some admired seeing in them the embodiment of Andalusian culture, poetry, and passion intertwined. Others mocked, scandalized that a woman of noble blood would love so openly that she would allow herself to be seen not only as poetess, but as lover. Yet Wallada did not hide. She never would. She wore her love as she had worn her unveiling, with pride, with defiance, with no apology. For her, to love was not to surrender, but to affirm her freedom. She loved because she chose to love, and that choice was as much a declaration as any verse she embroidered upon her robe. Still, behind the beauty of their love lay the shadow of its fragility. Just as the orange blossoms fall at the height of their fragrance, so too love, no matter how radiant, carries within it the certainty of loss. Perhaps even in their sweetest moments, Wallada and Ibn Zaydun sensed this. Perhaps each kiss was shadowed by the knowledge that betrayal or separation would one day come. But what lovers do not live as though the present moment will endure forever? What lovers do not cling to each other as though their embrace might hold back the passage of time? So it was with them. They lived their love fully, recklessly, transforming each moment into poetry, as though poetry itself might outlast the falling of blossoms. The nights of Córdoba were filled with their voices. Guests in Wallada's salons heard their verses, sometimes exchanged in public, their love not hidden, but woven into the fabric of communal art. Their intimacy became part of the city's memory, preserved in lines recited, repeated, written, and sung. Perhaps this was their greatest gift to one another, that their love, even in its impermanence, became immortal through poetry. For when blossoms fall, their fragrance still lingers. When love ends, its verses still breathe. Yet even now, as we linger in the sweetness of their early love, we must not forget the sound that accompanies the falling of petals: silence. For silence is the companion of beauty, and silence waits at the edge of joy. The petals fall soft against the stone, and lovers walk among them, unaware of the shadows gathering. Tonight the air is fragrant, their laughter soft, their hands entwined. Tomorrow the first shadow may appear, the first sign of jealousy, of betrayal, of loss. But for now, let us remain in their garden. Let us hear their verses rise and overlap. Let us feel the sweetness of their union as though it might last forever. The blossoms have fallen. They lie scattered, pale and silent upon the ground. And in the quiet after their fall, shadows begin to stretch across the courtyard, creeping steadily toward the lovers. Footsteps retreat into the dark, carrying with them the first signs of change, the first breath of betrayal yet to come. The footsteps retreated into the dark, their sound faint against the stone, but heavy with the promise of change. Where once the nights of Córdoba had been filled with laughter and the fragrance of blossoms, shadows now began to stretch across the courtyards of love. For no union of two brilliant souls can remain untouched by envy, by intrigue, by the restless movements of ambition. Wallada and Ibn Zaydun, who had seemed as radiant as twin stars in their first embrace, soon found their brilliance threatened by clouds, gathering silently above them. Jealousy, like a thief, crept into their lives, and rivalry, like a hidden blade, began to glint at the edges of their joy. It began, perhaps, not with betrayal, but with the gaze of others. Wallada's salons, alive with music and verse, attracted men of wit and ambition, men who sought not only the company of poets, but the attention of their hostess. To some, Wallada was muse; to others, prize. Their admiration, spoken or unspoken, was a constant murmur in the background of her love with Ibn Zaydun. And though Wallada did not conceal her affection for him, the knowledge that others desired her could not have escaped his notice. Ibn Zaydun, proud and possessive, must have felt the sting of those glances. The unease of knowing his beloved was admired by many. Was his jealousy born of love or of pride? In truth, the two are seldom separable, and Wallada herself was no woman to diminish her light for the comfort of another. She had chosen to live unveiled, to host gatherings where men and women spoke as equals, to declare her love openly. To ask her to retreat, to hide, to live quietly, would be to ask her to cease being herself. She would not do it. Thus, in her very defiance of silence, she stoked the fires of Ibn Zaydun's insecurity. He loved her boldness, but her boldness also wounded him. How could a man so ambitious endure to share the gaze of the city with his beloved? How could he endure the knowledge that her independence meant she might one day withdraw her favor, not from scandal, but from her own will? Beyond the walls of their love, politics too whispered its threats. Ibn Zaydun was not only a poet, he was a man entangled in the shifting allegiances of Córdoba. His ambitions extended into courtly life, into the dangerous realm of power where betrayal was common coin. Such ambitions required caution, alliances, sometimes secrets. And yet his love for Wallada was anything but secret. It was proclaimed, sung, embroidered into the very fabric of Córdoba's gossip. In this way, their passion made him vulnerable. To rival factions, to jealous courtiers, to political enemies, his love was a weakness to exploit. Rumors could be sharpened into weapons, whispers into snares. A man who loved so boldly could also be betrayed boldly. And so the shadows grew. Small disagreements between lovers, words spoken too sharply, silences held too long, gained weight under the pressure of jealousy and intrigue. A smile given to another poet, a verse too admiring, a delay in meeting. Such things became sparks in dry fields, igniting quarrels that smoldered long after the words had ended. Wallada, proud and unyielding, would not soften her independence to soothe his doubts. Ibn Zaydun, fiery and ambitious, would not temper his jealousy to preserve her peace. Each sought to love the other fully, yet neither would surrender their pride. And thus their love, once a union of equals, became a contest of equals, each struggling to hold both love and freedom, both devotion and self. The city, ever eager for scandal, began to murmur. Whispers spread that their love was faltering, that jealousy had entered, that rivals hovered at the edges of their bond. Some whispered of secret meetings, of betrayals already begun. Others predicted the inevitable downfall, for how could two such fierce spirits remain bound without breaking? The air of Córdoba thickened with rumor, with speculation, with anticipation of the storm to come. And within the salons of Wallada, the guests listened not only to verses, but to the unspoken tension between their hosts. For poets cannot conceal their hearts, their words betray them. In their poetry, sweetness began to mingle with bitterness, tenderness with reproach. And listeners, keen-eared and curious, heard the truth before the lovers themselves admitted it. What is jealousy but the shadow cast by love's light? Without love, there is no jealousy. Yet jealousy, once it enters, darkens love until it is unrecognizable. Wallada and Ibn Zaydun were not the first lovers to suffer this, nor the last, but their suffering was magnified by the brilliance of their minds, by the pride of their spirits, by the sharpness of their tongues. Their quarrels were not only private wounds, they became verses recited, lines remembered, poems preserved. Their love was no longer only theirs. It belonged to the city, to history, to us, who still read their words centuries later. And so the shadows lengthened. In the courtyard where once blossoms fell, now the air was heavy with silence, with footsteps retreating into the night, with the slow gathering of clouds. The lovers still met, still embraced, still wrote verses of devotion, but beneath the sweetness lay a bitterness that could not be denied. The first cracks had appeared, and through those cracks the darkness would soon pour. What had begun as laughter now trembled on the edge of tears. What had begun as a union of equals was becoming a battlefield of equals. And yet, even in their quarrels, their passion burned so fiercely that the world could not look away. The footsteps retreat still into darker and darker corridors. Soon those footsteps will lead not to reconciliation, but to betrayal, to scandal more piercing than unveiling, to humiliation that will leave scars upon poetry itself. For every love story must choose its path, to endure, to fade, or to fracture. Wallada and Ibn Zaydun, bound by pride and by passion, were destined for the last, and as the footsteps vanish into silence, ink is already being prepared, ready to stain the page with the record of betrayal. The ink spread across the page, dark and uneven, as though carrying the weight of something more than words. In the silence that followed the retreating footsteps, there came a moment when love was no longer only threatened by jealousy, but wounded by betrayal. For Ibn Zaydun, restless in both ambition and desire, allowed his heart, or perhaps only his body, to stray. The story told by the chroniclers is tangled, woven of rumor and half-truth, yet its shape is clear enough. He turned his attention to another, perhaps a slave girl whose beauty was whispered of in Córdoba, or perhaps a noblewoman whose favor promised him advancement. The details shift with the tellers, but the essence remains. He betrayed Wallada, and in betraying her, he shattered the fragile trust that had bound them. One can imagine the moment of discovery. Perhaps it was a letter, hastily written and carelessly delivered. its ink still fresh when it fell into the wrong hands. Perhaps it was the whisper of servants, words carried on soft voices that reached Wallada's ears like daggers. Perhaps it was the boldness of the woman herself, known to all, leaving no space for doubt. However it came, it arrived like a sudden storm, striking without warning, tearing branches from the tree of love. For Wallada, who had endured scandal, who had endured her father's fall, who had endured the whispers of an entire city, this betrayal was different. It was not the world's cruelty. It was the cruelty of the one she had chosen to love. What did she feel in that moment? Was it sorrow? A deep wound of the heart? Was it fury? The fire of a proud spirit scorned? Was it both at once, sorrow and fury mingling until they could not be separated? Her pride would not allow her to weep before others. Her wit would not allow her to remain silent. And so, as always, she answered with words. Not words of pleading, not words of reconciliation, but words of scorn, sharp as knives, unforgettable in their bite. If Ibn Zaydun had sought another's embrace, she would make sure all of Córdoba knew it, and knew also her contempt. She composed verses that ridiculed him, verses that exposed his weakness, verses that scorched his reputation as surely as fire consumes dry leaves. To write such lines was not only to wound him, but to declare her independence once more. She was no abandoned lover, fading into silence. She was Wallada, poetess and princess, and she would make of betrayal a weapon more powerful than any sword. And indeed, her lines live still, centuries later, sharp as the day they were first spoken, mocking him as unworthy, dismissing him as a man undone by desire. To be immortalized by her scorn was a punishment as lasting as her love had once been sweet. Ibn Zaydun, for his part, did not remain silent either. He too wrote verses of apology, of longing, of bitterness. He begged forgiveness in poetry that still trembles with sincerity, yet Wallada was not moved. Perhaps she had loved too fiercely to forgive easily. Perhaps her pride was too great to allow reconciliation. Perhaps she saw in his betrayal not only the weakness of a man, but the inevitability of ambition, the hunger for novelty, the restless striving that no single woman could ever satisfy. Whatever her reasons, she rejected him, and in rejecting him, she ensured their love would never again be whole. The city of Córdoba delighted in their quarrel. Lovers' quarrels are always the talk of the curious, but when lovers are poets, their quarrels become public performance, their pain transformed into art for all to consume. Every verse Wallada wrote against Ibn Zaydun was recited in markets, in taverns, in palaces. Every reply he wrote was weighed by scholars, debated by common folk, whispered in the streets. Their love, once private and fragrant as a hidden garden, had become a theater for the entire city, and every citizen a spectator. Scandal had been Wallada's companion since youth, but now scandal was joined by heartbreak, and the two together wove a legend that could never be forgotten. And yet, beneath the scorn and ridicule, was there not still a trace of longing? Could Wallada, proud as she was, have felt in some hidden chamber of her heart the ache of love that refuses to die? Could Ibn Zaydun, for all his betrayals, have felt still the pull of the woman who had been his muse? Poetry itself suggests so, for in their verses, tenderness lingers even in reproach. But pride is a wall higher than any palace, and once raised, it seldom falls. They would wound each other with words, but they would not return to the innocence of blossoms falling in the garden. The ink continued to stain the page, line after line of scorn, line after line of apology, each darker than the last. The torn letter, the careless act, the whispered betrayal, all became fuel for verses that seared through Córdoba's memory. And as their quarrel grew, the sound of torn silk returned, no longer the sound of unveiling, but of love itself unraveling. The cloth of their union could not be mended. Each attempt only revealed more frayed edges, and in the silence that followed her verses of scorn, ashes seemed to fall, settling upon the memory of what once had been sweet. The ashes do not vanish. They settle upon the stones, upon the pages, upon the hearts of those who remember. And as they settle, silence follows, heavy and unresolved, leaving only the faint hiss of words like fire. In that silence, the next chapter begins, for after the fire of scorn comes the long quiet of separation, and with separation, the bitter exile of Ibn Zaydun. The ashes settled, fine and silent, upon stone and upon parchment, but the faint hiss of fire did not die. It lingered in the air, like a sound remembered in the ear long after the flame is gone. From those embers came the sharpest verses of Wallada's pen, lines that cut not only Ibn Zaydun, but the very fabric of Córdoba's polite society. For she, once the beloved, once the muse, once the partner in passion, had been scorned. And a scorned woman of wit does not retire in silence. She composes. She takes ink as weapon, she takes rhythm as blade, and she wounds more deeply than any soldier in battle. Wallada's revenge was not in whispers behind closed doors, but in verses spoken aloud, in lines recited and remembered, in ridicule that no man, however ambitious, could escape. It is told that she wrote of Ibn Zaydun with biting disdain, mocking his betrayal, mocking his weakness, mocking even his manhood. Her words, preserved in fragments, carry the sharp edge of a voice that would not soften. They accuse him of cowardice, of hypocrisy, of failing to live up to the greatness of the poetry he himself composed. And the people of Córdoba, hungry for scandal, seized upon her lines with delight. They recited them in the streets, in markets, in the salons of others. They laughed at Ibn Zaydun, the proud poet, undone not by a rival's sword, but by a woman's verse. His shame was made public, his wounds displayed for all to see. Such is the cruelty of poetry. It endures. Long after the quarrel has cooled, long after the lovers are gone, the verses remain, sharp as the day they were first spoken. What did Ibn Zaydun feel, hearing these lines upon the lips of strangers? He, who had been her equal in wit, her companion in passion, now found himself reduced to subject, to mockery. Did he rage? Did he despair? Did he secretly admire her sharpness, even as it burned him? We cannot know, for men wounded in pride rarely confess admiration for the hand that struck them. Yet perhaps, in some corner of his heart, he knew that her verses ensured his immortality as much as his own writings did, for without Wallada, Ibn Zaydun would have been a poet among many. With her, he became part of a legend, a story told in sighs and laughter, in admiration and in ridicule. And yet, though her words mocked him, one cannot help but wonder if beneath the ridicule lay sorrow. For love, once true, cannot be erased so swiftly. Scorn may be the armor of grief, ridicule the mask of heartbreak. Wallada's verses may have been sharpened by pride, but they were perhaps forged in the fire of loss. Her words, so cutting, may have been the only way she could bear the betrayal, the only way she could continue to live unveiled before the world. To speak tenderness would have been to reveal weakness. To speak scorn was to declare strength. And so she chose scorn, and history remembers her for it. Her lines did not fall into silence. They became part of the chorus of Córdoba's life. Poetry in that city was not mere ornament. It was power, reputation, memory. A caliph might rule with soldiers, but a poet ruled with verses, and verses endured longer than soldiers. Wallada understood this well. She made herself unforgettable by ensuring that her words would be repeated, even when they were cruel. She turned private pain into public art, and in doing so, she transformed her betrayal into triumph. For who, after all, remembers the name of the slave girl or the details of the affair? What remains is Wallada's voice, clear, mocking, immortal. Still, not all was laughter. To mock is to admit hurt, however veiled. To scorn is to confess that one has been wounded. And in the quiet, after the laughter of her audience faded, perhaps Wallada herself sat in silence, feeling the weight of what had been lost. A love once fragrant as orange blossoms had turned to ashes. A union once alive with verses had become a battlefield of ridicule. Did she ever regret? Did she ever wish she could return to the garden, to the sweetness of laughter overlapping with his? Perhaps. But pride is a wall higher than longing, and Wallada's pride was unassailable. She would not lower her head, even for love. Better to be remembered as the scornful poetess than as the woman who forgave a betrayal too easily. The hiss of her words spread far beyond the walls of her salon. Scholars noted them, rivals repeated them, admirers marveled at their audacity. In them, Wallada carved a place for herself in a tradition dominated by men. She proved that a woman's voice could not only echo but resound, could not only join the chorus, but command it. Her scorn was not only personal, it was also symbolic. She spoke not only for herself, but for every woman silenced, every woman betrayed, every woman told to endure quietly. Her verses said, "I will not endure. I will not be silent. I will not be erased." And so the ashes settled, but the fire remained, a fire not of love, but of defiance. Wallada had turned betrayal into a new kind of unveiling, an unveiling of her wit, of her unyielding strength. She had stripped Ibn Zaydun not of his robe, but of his dignity, and she had done so with nothing more than ink and voice. The hiss of her words was louder than the clash of swords, more enduring than the shouts of soldiers. In the end, it was her ridicule, not his betrayal, that history preserved. The fire hissed still, even as its flames dimmed, leaving only embers glowing red against the dark. And as the embers cooled, ashes drifted once more, settling upon the memory of what once had been. In that silence, the next chapter began, not with reconciliation, but with distance. For Ibn Zaydun, wounded in pride and in politics, would soon find himself cast into exile, and Wallada, proud in her scorn, would remain, watching the door close behind him. The door closed with a sound that lingered in the ear, neither sharp nor sudden, but heavy, as though wood and iron carried within them the weight of parting. Behind that door lay the house of Wallada, filled with the memory of laughter, of whispered verses, of quarrels that had burned too brightly. Beyond it lay the streets of Córdoba, already whispering with rumor, already echoing with the scandal of betrayal and the sharpness of her scorn. For Ibn Zaydun, the door did not close only on her house, but on an entire chapter of his life. His exile was not only from her presence, but from the city itself, from the fragile security of status and ambition he had once pursued. Politics, always restless in al-Andalus, tightened its net around him. Enemies seized their chance, rivals sharpened their accusations, and the poet who had once walked proudly through the salons of Córdoba now found himself cast out, a wanderer in search of refuge. One can imagine his steps, slow at first, then hurried as he left behind the city of his birth. Did he pause at the threshold, hoping for her voice, her forgiveness, some sign that the door might open again? Or did he walk swiftly, pride wounded, unwilling to turn his head lest he reveal his longing? The chronicles do not tell us. What they tell us is that exile became his fate, and longing his companion. For though he would find protection in other courts, though he would write verses of beauty still, the loss of Wallada haunted him, seeping into his poems like a shadow that never left. Wallada remained in Córdoba. Proud, unveiled, untamed, she continued her life without him, her salon still vibrant, her presence still scandalous. Yet the absence of Ibn Zaydun left its mark, as silence leaves its mark after music ends. For all her scorn, for all her ridicule, the void he left could not be wholly filled. Love once lived does not vanish with a door's closing. It lingers in memory, in the sudden pang when a verse recalls a shared moment, in the scent of blossoms that once accompanied a kiss. She would not forgive him, she would not call him back, but perhaps she carried within her a secret ache, hidden behind the armor of her wit. Pride demanded silence, but the heart remembers what pride denies. Ibn Zaydun in exile turned his longing into poetry. His most famous verses, those that endure in anthologies and recitations, are filled with remembrance of Wallada, of her beauty, of their union, of his regret. He wrote of her as the moon that lit his nights, as the garden that once gave him fragrance, as the beloved lost through folly. His words are tender, aching, alive with yearning, and yet, no matter how beautiful, they did not bring him back to her. Poetry, though immortal, could not reopen the door that pride had closed. He would remain outside, forever the lover, longing, forever the poet in exile. What is exile but a mirror of separation? To be cast from one city is to be torn from the familiar, from the walls and streets that shaped one's days. To be cast from one's beloved is the same wound, carried not in the body but in the soul. Ibn Zaydun suffered both at once, exile from his city, exile from his love. His poetry bears the marks of this double loss, its beauty sharpened by sorrow, its sweetness tinged with bitterness. And Wallada, though she stood firm in her rejection, could not have been untouched by the knowledge that her former lover, her rival in verse, her equal in passion, now wandered without her. Even in her scorn, she remained the axis of his memory. The people of Córdoba watched, as they always did. They spoke of Ibn Zaydun's exile, of Wallada's defiance, of the verses exchanged between them. To them, it was entertainment, tragedy made into art, a story to be recited at gatherings. But for the two at its heart, it was more than story. It was wound, it was longing, it was the ache of what might have been. The closing of that door was not merely an end, it was the beginning of years of separation, years that would deepen their legend even as it broke their hearts. In the quiet of her house, when the guests had gone, when the lamps burned low, perhaps Wallada sat alone, remembering. Did she ever speak his name aloud in those silences? Did she ever let herself imagine his face, his voice, his verses of apology? Perhaps she did, but if so, she kept it hidden, for her pride was unyielding. Better to be remembered as the woman who scorned than as the woman who wept. And so she wore her defiance like armor, while within, perhaps, the old wound throbbed. And what of Ibn Zaydun, wandering in exile? He must have carried with him the scent of Córdoba, the memory of its gardens, the echo of Wallada's laughter. In his verses, we hear him speaking not only to her, but to the city itself, as though Wallada and Córdoba were one, as though to lose her was to lose his home, his place, his belonging. His longing for her and his longing for Córdoba intertwine until they are indistinguishable, until his exile from the city and his exile from her become a single sorrow. The door had closed. It did not open again. Time passed, years perhaps, but the memory of their union remained alive, sustained by poetry, by rumor, by the inexhaustible fascination of those who listened. For even in separation, they continued to speak to one another through verse, answering scorn with apology, ridicule with longing, bitterness with tenderness. Their love, broken though it was, refused to die completely. It lived on in words, in memory, in the very air of Córdoba, as though the city itself carried their voices in its stones. The door remains closed in our imagination, heavy, immovable. And beyond it the road stretches out, long and uncertain, leading Ibn Zaydun away into exile. The dust of that road clings to his robe, the horizon swallows him slowly, and behind him, in the silence of the city, Wallada stands, her face turned not towards the door, but toward the sky, proud, defiant, unyielding. Between them lies the distance of pride, the distance of betrayal, the distance of time itself. And in that distance, poetry blooms, fragile and eternal, like flowers growing between stones. The road continues, stretching farther, carrying him beyond sight. And as it vanishes, the sound that remains is not footsteps, but a low murmur of voices, reciting verses in the salons of Córdoba. For though the lovers are apart, their words still meet, murmuring across the distance, murmuring like water through a hidden stream, unseen yet always flowing. The murmurs continued, voices low yet insistent, rising in the salons of Córdoba and in the shaded courtyards where poets gathered. Though Ibn Zaydun had been cast into exile, though the door of Wallada's house had closed upon him, their voices did not cease to meet. For poetry knows no boundaries, no walls, no distance too great to cross. Verse carries itself from one mouth to another, from one city to the next, until words spoken in sorrow and exile are answered in scorn within Córdoba, until laughter in a salon replies to longing uttered far away. And so, even apart, Wallada and Ibn Zaydun continued their dialogue, their rivalry sustained not in whispered meetings, but in lines of poetry that reached each other like letters carried on the wind. His verses came first, tender and aching, filled with remembrance. He wrote of her beauty, of her presence, of the sweetness of their union. He wrote of regret, of sorrow at betrayal, of longing for forgiveness. He wrote as a man who had lost not only a woman but a world, for in losing Wallada, he had lost the very heart of Córdoba. His words trembled with sincerity, and those who heard them could not help but be moved. Yet sincerity is no guarantee of pardon, and Wallada, sharp in her pride, was not softened. For every tender verse he composed, she answered with mockery, every apology met with disdain, every plea with a reminder of his betrayal. And the people listened, astonished and delighted, for it was as though they were witnessing a great drama unfold upon the stage of poetry. The roles of lover and beloved transformed into adversaries, locked in endless exchange. One can imagine the gatherings where such verses were recited. A poet newly arrived from exile carries with him a fresh composition of Ibn Zaydun, and the room falls silent as he begins to recite. The words are filled with longing, with the memory of a kiss, with the ache of absence. The listeners sigh, some with pity, some with admiration. And then, days later, within Wallada's salon, she herself recites her reply, her voice clear, her words biting, dismissing him with laughter, exposing his weakness, ridiculing his desire. The listeners gasp, then laugh, then nod in admiration of her sharpness. Thus, through poetry, their quarrel lived on, fed by pride, sustained by memory, witnessed by all. What is remarkable is not only the sharpness of her scorn or the tenderness of his longing, but the way in which both refused to be silent. In most tales of love betrayed, one voice falls quiet, one lover retreats into shadow while the other tells the story. But here, Both spoke, both wrote, both answered. And so their love, though broken, remained alive in dialogue, a dialogue more enduring than any reconciliation could have been. They became not merely former lovers, but rivals in verse, two poets shaping each other's legacies, two voices entwined in a struggle of memory. Without Wallada, Ibn Zaydun's poems would lack their sharpest edge. Without Ibn Zaydun, Wallada's verses of scorn would lack their target. Together, even in enmity, they created a body of poetry that outlived their quarrel, outlived their city, outlived even the caliphate itself. What is rivalry but another form of intimacy? To write to another, even in scorn, is to remain bound to them. To answer their words with one's own is to confess that their presence still lingers, if only as wound or challenge. Wallada and Ibn Zaydun, though apart, though estranged, though hostile, remained bound in this way. Their rivalry was a thread stretched tight between them, vibrating with every verse, refusing to break. And the people of Córdoba, hungry for stories, delighted in plucking that thread, repeating their words, ensuring that neither could escape the other's voice. Perhaps in the quiet of night, each felt the irony. Ibn Zaydun, longing still, must have known that her scorn was itself a form of attention, proof that she had not forgotten him. Wallada, proud and defiant, must have known that her mockery kept his presence alive, that to answer him was to admit he still mattered. And so, even as they wounded one another, they preserved each other. Their rivalry ensured that their names would be forever linked, as inseparable in memory as they had once been in love. The city itself seemed to echo their voices. In the markets, sellers recited their lines as entertainment. In palaces, courtiers debated their verses, arguing over which was sharper, which more beautiful, which more true. In taverns, laughter rang out as Wallada's scorn was repeated. In mosques, scholars preserved the lines, copying them onto parchment, ensuring their survival. Their private quarrel had become public property, their intimacy transformed into legend. And in this transformation lay both triumph and tragedy. Triumph, because their words were immortal. Tragedy, because their wounds could never heal while the world delighted in keeping them open. The murmur of verses continued, flowing like water through every corner of Córdoba, carrying with it the sound of two voices that could not fall silent. And as the murmurs grew, as the rivalry deepened, the city itself began to falter. For while poets recited, politics crumbled. The caliphate fractured further, its power slipping away, its once mighty halls growing weaker. The decline of Córdoba mirrored the decline of their love, each once golden, now shadowed, each still beautiful, yet fragile. And within this decline, their rivalry seemed almost symbolic, two great figures bound in struggle even as the world around them dissolved. The murmurs fade, but not into silence. They fade into the sound of lips moving softly, reciting verses not aloud but in memory, as though the words themselves had become prayers or curses whispered into the air. For even when the gatherings ended, even when the salons grew quiet, the verses lived on in the hearts of those who had heard them. And in that soft, continuous recitation, the voices of Wallada and Ibn Zaydun endured, locked forever in rivalry, forever in dialogue, forever refusing to fall silent. And as lips move in silence, the next image arises. The city itself, once splendid, now crumbling, its walls cracked, its gardens neglected, its power dissipating. For just as love falters, so too does glory. And the story of Wallada cannot be told without the story of Córdoba's decline. The lips moved in silence, verses recited softly like prayers remembered in the dark. But outside the chambers of poets, another kind of silence gathered. It was the silence of walls crumbling, of gardens untended, of a city once radiant beginning to falter. Córdoba, jewel of al-Andalus, whose mosques and palaces had been the envy of the world, was now fractured, weakened, its splendor cracking like old marble. The great caliphate had already dissolved, broken into the rivalries of petty kings, and the city that had once ruled an empire now struggled to hold even itself. Dust gathered in corners once polished, fountains grew green with neglect, soldiers walked uneasy in streets where power shifted like sand. Just as Wallada's love had broken into scorn and rivalry, so too did her city fracture into decline, its glory now shadowed by whispers of ruin. One imagines her walking through Córdoba in these years, unveiled still, her presence as bold as ever, but with eyes that saw more than admiration and scandal. She must have noticed the cracks in the plaster of palaces, the emptiness of markets once overflowing, the nervousness of courtiers who no longer served a stable ruler but a fragile one. The city of her youth, where learning had flourished and poetry had been abundant as flowers, was changing. Its decline was slow, not sudden, like a lamp that burns lower with each night, yet its dimming was unmistakable. And Wallada, who had built her life upon defiance, must have felt a kinship between her own fractured story and the city that mirrored it. Her salons continued, though perhaps with fewer guests, perhaps with more guarded laughter. Poets still came, but their verses carried the heaviness of uncertain times. Politics entered even into gatherings of art, for who could ignore the shifting powers outside the door? Rivals plotted, factions grew, soldiers loyal today might be enemies tomorrow. To host a salon in such a world was itself an act of courage, for every guest might carry secrets, every verse might be heard as allegory. Yet Wallada did not close her doors. She continued, as always, to claim her freedom through the gathering of voices, as if in defiance of the silence creeping through Córdoba's streets. What must it have felt like to live in a city that was both beautiful and broken? Perhaps the beauty was more poignant because of the ruin. The gardens still bloomed, but with weeds among the roses. The fountains still flowed, but with water clouded by neglect. The mosques still rang with prayer, but the prayers were now shadowed by fear of what lay beyond the city walls. For enemies pressed closer, rival kingdoms sought to claim what remained of Córdoba's wealth, and the people, once proud of their city, now whispered anxiously of its fall. In such an atmosphere, poetry became both escape and record, a way of preserving what was vanishing, a way of resisting with words what could not be resisted with soldiers. Wallada's own poetry in these years must have carried the weight of this atmosphere. Though fragments remain, their sharpness suggests not only personal scorn, but also awareness of a larger decline. To ridicule a lover was one thing. To live in a city that ridiculed itself through its failures was another. Perhaps in mocking Ibn Zaydun, she also mocked the weakness of men who ruled poorly, who betrayed not only women but entire kingdoms. Perhaps in her proud declaration of independence, she was speaking also for Córdoba, a city that had once ruled proudly and now struggled to remain itself. Her voice became not only personal but symbolic, the echo of a world in which freedom was vanishing. And yet, even amid decline, beauty persisted. The evenings were still scented with jasmine, the moon still cast its silver light upon the Guadalquivir, the courtyard still echoed with music when strings were plucked. Such beauty set against ruin becomes sharper, more fleeting, more fragile. Wallada must have known this. Perhaps she treasured her salons all the more, knowing they might not last, knowing the world beyond her doors was crumbling. To live fully in such times is itself an act of rebellion. To love beauty while decay surrounds it is a kind of victory. Her life, scandalous as it was, might thus be seen as a reflection of Córdoba's own, bold, beautiful, fractured, unforgettable. The murmurs of decline grew louder. Stories spread of walls collapsing, of gardens abandoned, of scholars departing for other cities where patronage was stronger. Córdoba, once the center, was becoming a memory, a place spoken of in past tense even while it still stood. For those who loved it, this was a sorrow too deep for words. And for Wallada, whose very identity was bound to the city, it must have been like watching a beloved fade, unable to be saved. She had already known the loss of her father, the loss of her lover, the loss of innocence. Now she would know the loss of her city, a grief shared with all but borne in her own way, with her head held high, her words sharp, her presence unyielding. Perhaps in the quiet of night she walked through the courtyards alone, hearing the fountains drip, seeing the shadows of arches broken by moonlight. Perhaps she recited verses softly to herself, as if to keep alive the spirit of Córdoba through her own voice. Perhaps she wondered whether her scandalous life, her defiance, her salons, her love and her loss would be remembered when the city itself was dust. And perhaps she answered herself, as poets often do, with the knowledge that words outlive walls, that memory outlives marble. If Córdoba must fall, at least her verses would remain, carried by the lips of those who loved poetry, preserved by the pens of those who refused to let beauty die. The walls crumbled slowly, but surely. Dust rose into the wind, carrying with it the scent of ruin. And in that dust, one sees the reflection of Wallada herself, still standing, still radiant, yet surrounded by decline, her beauty sharpened by fragility. The city and the woman were bound, each scandalous in their own way, each unforgettable, each destined to fall but also to endure in memory. The dust rises, swirling in the wind, catching in the throat, stinging the eyes, and as it drifts across Córdoba's streets, the next image emerges. A sound of laughter, too loud, echoing through a salon, laughter that lingers after joy has gone, leaving behind only the emptiness of repetition. The laughter rang out, sudden and bright, echoing too long within the chamber, until it ceased to sound like joy and began instead to sound like emptiness. Guests smiled, their eyes flickering toward Wallada, who returned the laughter with grace, yet behind her eyes there lingered a weariness, a recognition that not all mirth springs from delight. For in these later years, though suitors and admirers still gathered around her, though companions still sought her company, the sweetness of love was no longer what it once had been. The presence of Ibn Zaydun, with whom she had known both passion and rivalry, had left a mark so deep that no other could fill it. Others came, yes, but they were shadows compared to him, echoes rather than voices, repetitions rather than revelations. Their laughter filled her rooms, but their absence filled her heart. She welcomed them still, these companions of her later life. Some were poets of modest skill, eager for her praise or fearful of her sharp tongue. Some were men of politics, hoping to cloak ambition with the perfume of poetry. Some were youths, dazzled by her legend, drawn to the scandal of loving the most notorious woman in Córdoba. They brought with them gifts, verses, gestures of devotion. They delighted for a night, for a season, for a fleeting moment. Yet none of them remained in memory as Ibn Zaydun did. None etched themselves upon her verses with the same fire. To love after him was like drinking watered wine. Pleasant, perhaps, but never intoxicating, and she knew it. Pride would not let her admit it, not aloud, not even in verse. But within, perhaps in the silent hours after guests had gone, she felt the hollowness, the echo where once there had been fullness. Love had not ended for her. It had merely changed. Where once it had been sweet and fragrant, now it was sharp and bitter. Where once it had been a garden, now it was a barren field where only thorns grew. Yet even thorns have beauty, and she wore them as she wore her words, boldly, without apology. Her companions must have sensed this. They must have known that though she welcomed them, though she exchanged verses with them, though she laughed at their wit, her heart was elsewhere, in memory, in rivalry, in the verses she had shared with another. Perhaps some resented it. Perhaps some sought to surpass it, but none succeeded. For Wallada was not a woman to give her heart twice with the same intensity. Once wounded, once betrayed, she had built a fortress of pride around herself, and those who entered her life entered only as guests, never as equals. They came and went, leaving behind fragments of verse, traces of gossip, but nothing more lasting. The city, of course, whispered about her lovers, her companions, her admirers. They spoke of names now forgotten, of scandals that seemed large at the time but faded swiftly. They delighted in attaching stories to her, in imagining her entanglements, in exaggerating her choices. But history, in its long memory, preserves none of these with clarity. It preserves only the union with Ibn Zaydun, for that was the flame, the others mere sparks. Wallada herself seemed to know this, for her later verses, though sharp, did not linger upon new loves as they had upon the old. She mocked, she ridiculed, she dismissed, but she did not immortalize. Perhaps she had learned that to immortalize is to give too much. Perhaps she had grown weary of turning her heart into spectacle. Or perhaps she had simply accepted that her great love, however broken, had already been lived, and that what followed could only be shadow. And yet she did not retreat into silence. She continued to host, to write, to speak. She continued to live unveiled, scandalous, defiant. Her later companions may not have filled her heart, but they filled her house, and through them she preserved the life she had chosen. To live without them would have been to surrender to solitude, and solitude, though noble, was not yet her path. She would laugh, even if the laughter echoed too long. She would welcome admiration, even if it did not satisfy. She would live boldly, even if the boldness no longer carried sweetness. For Wallada was not a woman to fade quietly. She would remain a presence, even if that presence was tinged with emptiness. There is a kind of beauty in repetition, even if it lacks freshness. The laughter of her companions, though hollow, still filled the rooms with sound. Their verses, though less sharp, still carried rhythm. Their presence, though fleeting, still brought warmth against the encroaching cold of time. Perhaps Wallada, though aware of the emptiness, chose to embrace it nonetheless, for to embrace emptiness is better than to be crushed by it. She was a master of turning weakness into strength, of turning scandal into armor. Perhaps she turned hollowness itself into a kind of performance, a mask worn with elegance, a way of saying, I have loved greatly, and though lesser loves follow, I remain sovereign. The echoes of their laughter lingered in her salons, but when the last guest departed, when the lamps were extinguished, the silence returned. And in that silence, perhaps she remembered. Perhaps she let herself feel the absence that pride concealed. Perhaps she whispered verses not for companions, but for herself, verses that admitted what her pride would not. But if she did, those verses are lost, hidden from us, swallowed by time. What remains are the fragments, the scorn, the laughter that echoed too long. And in that laughter, we hear the hollowness of repetition, the weariness of a woman who has lived too brightly to be satisfied with dim reflections. The laughter fades, leaving only silence heavy and deep. In that silence, a candle flickers, its flame trembling in the draught, its light soft against the walls. The candle burns still, but its wax drips steadily, marking the passage of time, marking the approach of solitude. And as the flame flickers, the story turns toward Wallada's later years, when laughter faded and companionship gave way to the dignity of chosen loneliness. The candle flickered, its flame trembling as though uncertain. the wax dripping slowly down its slender body, each drop marking the passage of time with silent insistence. In that dim light, Wallada's world grew smaller, not through defeat, but through choice. For in her later years, she turned away from the endless laughter of companions and the fleeting flattery of admirers. She withdrew into herself, into a solitude chosen rather than imposed. To many, this seemed a quiet decline, a fading of the scandalous radiance that had once shocked Córdoba. But to her, perhaps, it was not decline at all. It was dignity. It was sovereignty over herself, the final declaration of independence, to be alone, because she had chosen it, not because the world commanded it. One imagines her in her house, the salon quieter now, the cushions worn, the echoes of past voices lingering like ghosts in the corners. The lute strings are silent, the verses no longer exchanged with the same eagerness. Guests still come, but fewer. And they no longer linger as they once did. The world outside is changing. Córdoba is faltering more deeply, its streets heavier with dust, its glory dimmed. And Wallada, who once embodied scandal and brilliance, now embodies solitude, a figure of dignity who stands apart, her pride intact though her circle has diminished. She is no longer the young woman who embroidered her robe with verses and walked unveiled through the city. She is older now, her beauty changed, her presence less shocking but no less powerful. And in her solitude, she seems to carry within her the memory of all she has been, as though her very body were a living chronicle. What must her thoughts have been in these quiet hours? Did she look back upon her life with regret or with satisfaction? Did she remember the sweetness of blossoms, the laughter of Ibn Zaydun, the sharpness of her own scorn? Or did she think less of the past and more of the present, of the silence that now surrounded her, of the candle's flicker, of the weight of time? Perhaps she felt a mixture of all, pride in her boldness, sorrow for her losses, serenity in her choice of solitude. For Wallada was not a woman to be easily categorized, not in youth and not in age. Her solitude was not resignation but assertion, not weakness but strength. She lived as she had always lived, on her own terms. Her poetry in these years softened somewhat, though it did not lose its edge. The verses that remain suggest a woman reflective, aware of time, aware of the fragility of life, yet still unwilling to bow. There is tenderness in her later lines, but also the same pride that had defined her youth. She did not repent her scandal, nor did she wish to erase her boldness. Instead, she seemed to carry it with her into solitude, as if to say, "I have lived as I chose, and now I will be alone as I choose." For her, solitude was not punishment, but completion, the final act in a life of defiance. The candlelight revealed the wrinkles upon her hands, the silver threads in her hair, the slower grace of her movements. Yet in her eyes, perhaps, the same fire burned still, the same refusal to be diminished. Visitors might have found her less dazzling, but more formidable. For what is more formidable than a woman who has faced scandal, betrayal, gossip, and decline, and still stands, alone yet unbroken? She'd been many things in her life: princess, poetess, lover, rival, hostess. But now she was simply herself, stripped of roles, wrapped in dignity. Her solitude was her crown, invisible but unshakable. Outside, Córdoba continued its decline. The streets grew poorer, the palaces emptier, the sound of politics more desperate. Yet within her house, Wallada created a small realm untouched by that chaos. Her solitude was not silence, it was contemplation. She still wrote, still recited, still allowed her voice to be heard when she chose. But she no longer sought to dazzle or to shock. She no longer embroidered her defiance upon silk for all to see. She no longer needed to. Her very existence, Her survival into age on her own terms was scandal enough. In a world that sought to confine women, she had lived freely. In a world that sought to shame her, she had embraced shame and turned it into power. In a world that sought to define her through others, she had defined herself. Solitude was her final declaration of victory. The wax continued to drip, pooling at the base of the candle, each drop a reminder that time cannot be defied forever. And perhaps she knew this. Perhaps she felt the weight of her years more heavily now. Yet if death approached, it did not terrify her. She had lived a life so full of words, so full of scandal, so full of defiance that death could not erase her. She had already achieved what so few ever do. She had carved her name into memory, into poetry, into history. Whether loved or scorned, admired or ridiculed, she was remembered. And to be remembered is a kind of immortality. Perhaps, as she sat in the flickering candlelight, she smiled at this thought, knowing that her solitude was not emptiness, but fulfillment. The candle flickered again, the wax dripping more quickly now, the flame bending in the draught. Around her the room was quiet, the echoes of laughter gone, the voices of companions faded, only the sound of wax dripping, steady, insistent, marking the passage of time. And in that sound, perhaps, she found a kind of peace. For life itself is like a candle. It burns brightly, it flickers, it drips away, and at last it is extinguished. But the light it has cast cannot be unmade. It lingers in memory, in the eyes that once saw it, in the words that describe it. Wallada's life was such a flame, brilliant, flickering, dripping, yet unforgettable. The wax dripped still, forming a small pool upon the table, pale against the wood. And as it gathers, a breeze stirs, shifting the flame, carrying with it a whisper, a question that lingers in the air. Was her defiance, her scandal, her solitude worth the cost? The question hangs unanswered, suspended like smoke above the candle, and it is upon that unanswered question that the story turns, leading into reflection on her boldness, her legacy, and the ambiguity of freedom. The question lingered above the candle flame, suspended like smoke, shifting but never settling. Was it worth it? Was her defiance, her scandal, her unveiling, her laughter and her scorn, the solitude she had chosen in the end, was it worth the cost? The question, unspoken, hovered over Wallada's life as surely as it hovers over the memory of her name. For what does it mean to live freely in a world built upon walls, veils, and silence? To some it means triumph, to others exile. To Wallada it may have meant both at once, glory and isolation entwined so tightly that neither can be separated from the other. Her life itself was a paradox, radiant and tragic, scandalous and dignified, a flame that gave light even as it consumed itself. She had refused the veil, refused seclusion, refused to live as women of her station were expected to live. She had chosen instead to walk unveiled through Córdoba, to embroider her verses upon her robes, to host salons where men and women gathered as equals. In doing so, she won admiration, astonishment, immortality. Yet she also won the enmity of her peers, the ridicule of the envious, the loneliness of those who choose paths few dare to follow. To be free is to be alone, often. And perhaps she knew this from the first, from the moment she tore the silk of convention and stepped into the light. Perhaps she knew that her life would not be easy, that it would carry heartbreak, betrayal, loss. Yet she chose it anyway. That choice was her crown. Some would say she lived scandalously. But what is scandal except the judgment of others upon a freedom they do not understand? To her, scandal was not sin, but truth. She lived as she wished, and the world called it scandal because it could not imagine a woman living so. If scandal is the price of honesty, then perhaps she paid it willingly. If loneliness is the price of freedom, then perhaps she accepted it with dignity. She was not innocent, she was not gentle, she was not silent, she was herself. And to be oneself fully in defiance of expectation is both triumph and tragedy. Her poetry reveals this ambiguity. In some verses, she is proud, mocking, unyielding, declaring her independence with fierce clarity. In others, there lingers tenderness, sorrow, the ache of betrayal, the quiet confession of loss. She was not one thing, but many, and her words preserve those contradictions. They invite us to ask, was she happy? Was she free? But perhaps happiness and freedom were not her aim. Perhaps her aim was simply to live without disguise, to leave behind verses that no one could erase, to be remembered not as obedient, but as unforgettable. In this, she succeeded beyond measure. Even centuries later, her name is spoken, her words recited, her scandal remembered. Few can claim so much, and yet the question remains, at what cost? Did her independence isolate her? Did her pride deny her reconciliation? Did her defiance leave her in solitude when others might have found comfort in compromise? These are questions we cannot answer, only imagine, for memory preserves the shape of her life, but not the fullness of her heart. We know her scorn, but we do not know her tears. We know her defiance, but we do not know her doubts. Perhaps she never doubted, or perhaps she doubted always, carrying her questions like shadows hidden beneath her radiant presence. Perhaps even she herself did not know, for who among us can measure the cost of freedom with certainty? Córdoba itself, declining around her, seemed to mirror these questions. The city, once glorious, had lived boldly, had claimed to rival the greatest capitals of the world, and now it stood in ruins, fragmented, diminished. Was its glory worth its fall? Was its brilliance worth its fragility? The same question hung over both woman and city, as if their fates were bound. Wallada, like Córdoba, lived proudly, magnificently, scandalously, and like Córdoba, she endured decline, solitude, loss. Yet both remain immortal, remembered for what they were, not for what they lacked. Perhaps that is answer enough. The candle flame trembled, casting shifting shadows upon the walls. In those shadows one might see her as a young woman again, her robe gleaming with embroidered verses, her eyes fierce, her laughter bright. One might see her seated in her salon surrounded by poets, her wit sparking like fire. One might see her leaning close to Ibn Zaydun, their voices entwined in verse, their love alive with both tenderness and rivalry. One might see her older, alone, the silver in her hair gleaming in candlelight, her pride intact though her world had diminished. All these images are true, all belong to her. She was not one story, but many, not one verse, but a collection of verses, not one woman, but many women within a single name. Perhaps this is her greatest legacy, the refusal to be reduced. The whisper above the candle remains unanswered because some questions have no answer. Was it worth it? To her, perhaps, the worth was in the living itself, in the refusal to bow, in the scandal that ensured her immortality. To us, perhaps, the worth lies in the story she left, a story that continues to provoke, to inspire, to unsettle. For every listener must answer for themselves whether freedom is worth loneliness, whether defiance is worth scandal, whether pride is worth the absence of reconciliation. Wallada's life does not tell us, it only shows us, leaving us to draw our own conclusions. The candle burns lower, the wax nearly spent, the flame small but steady. Above it, the air stirs, carrying with it the unanswered question into the night. And as it drifts, the question dissolves into silence, a silence heavy with the stillness of earth, the stillness that follows when a grave is closed, when a life ends, when a voice falls silent. For beyond reflection lies the inevitability of death, and beyond death lies the memory of those who remain. And it is upon that stillness that the next part of her story begins, with the death of Ibn Zaydun and the echo it left in Wallada's life. The stillness of earth lay heavy, the final sound of soil falling upon wood, muffled and solemn, closing a grave. Ibn Zaydun, once the proud poet of Córdoba, once the lover whose verses mingled with Wallada's in passion and in scorn, was gone. His life, filled with brilliance and betrayal, had ended as all lives must, beneath the silence of earth. The people mourned him, for he had been a poet beloved, his verses sung across al-Andalus, his fame secure. But for Wallada, what did his death mean? Was it the release of an old wound, the quiet end to a rivalry that had lasted too long? Or was it the reopening of sorrow, the reminder that even those who wound us are part of us, that their absence is as heavy as their presence once was? The chronicles do not say. They tell us only that he died and she lived on. Yet we can imagine the silence in her chamber when the news reached her, the flicker of the candle, the long gaze into shadows. She had scorned him, yes. She had mocked him, dismissed him, turned his betrayal into ridicule, yet she had also loved him, once, more fiercely than she would ever love again. Love and scorn, tenderness and pride cannot erase each other. They coexist, each sharpening the other, and when he died, perhaps she felt the paradox of it all. To lose him was to lose not only a man but a mirror, for who else had matched her wit? Who else had drawn from her verses as much fire? Who else had been both muse and rival, beloved and enemy? In his absence, perhaps she felt not triumph, but emptiness, the silence of a voice that had always answered hers, even if in bitterness. Now the dialogue was ended, and she was left alone with her words. The poets of Córdoba mourned him openly, reciting his verses, remembering his elegance, his passion, his political ambitions, his exile and his return. His memory was preserved with honor, despite the scandals of his life. And Wallada, who had shared his scandal more than any, must have listened. Did she hear his words in her memory, the lines of longing, the pleas for forgiveness, the confessions of love? Did she recite them softly to herself, alone, admitting what pride would never allow her to admit aloud? Or did she harden herself still, refusing even in death to soften her scorn? Perhaps she did both, for the heart is never simple. Perhaps in one moment she mocked him, and in the next she wept. Perhaps in one breath she declared his death no loss, and in the next she remembered his touch. Such contradictions were her truth, and in them lies her immortality. His grave was closed, the earth still. But memory does not close with a grave. Memory lingers, stirring in the night, whispering verses in the mind, reminding us of what once was. For Wallada, Ibn Zaydun's memory must have haunted her, not as constant pain, but as shadow, sometimes heavy, sometimes faint, but never wholly gone. In her later solitude, when the candle flickered low and the silence deepened, perhaps she felt his presence more than she had in years. For death transforms even enemies into companions of memory. And in this way, though their love had broken, though their rivalry had endured, he remained with her, bound to her as surely in death as he had been in life. There is a cruelty in death, but also a kind of mercy. In death, quarrels end. In death, words of scorn lose their edge, for the one they mock can no longer answer. Perhaps Wallada, sharp in life, softened in memory. Perhaps she allowed herself to recall not the betrayal, not the quarrels, not the exile, but the sweetness of blossoms, the laughter of overlapping verses, the tenderness of love before pride divided them. Perhaps his death gave her permission to remember without anger, to grieve without scorn. Or perhaps not. Perhaps her pride remained unyielding even to the grave, and she thought only, "He is gone, and I remain." Both possibilities are true, for in her life she was never one thing only. And yet, the timing of his death bears weight. For even as Ibn Zaydun's body lay beneath earth, Córdoba itself was sliding deeper into ruin. The city that had given birth to both poets, that had witnessed their love and their quarrels, was nearing its end. The Almoravids pressed upon it, and soon it would fall. His death, her solitude, the city's decline, all were entwined, all part of the same fading. It was as though the closing of his grave was also the closing of an era, the end of Córdoba's golden voice. Wallada must have felt this, must have sensed that with his death, with the city's decline, her own life was nearing its final chapter. And yet she endured, the last flame of a dying brilliance, the last voice of a fading world. The stillness of earth above his grave echoes still, deep and heavy. And in that stillness, Wallada's figure stands, solitary, dignified, proud, yet touched by memory. Her own poetry in these years carried sorrow, though sharpened by pride. She wrote still, but her verses were quieter, more reflective, less mocking, more aware of time. The sharp wit had not deserted her, but it had softened into reflection. For when one has lived long enough, when one has seen both glory and ruin, love and betrayal, pride and solitude, words themselves become slower, deeper, less eager to wound. In her later poetry, perhaps, we hear the echo of loss, not only of a man, but of a city, of a world, of an age. The grave closed, the earth still. But the silence after the closing was not absolute. It carried with it echoes, faint but persistent, like voices reciting in memory. Ibn Zaydun's voice, once proud, once pleading, now only a whisper. Wallada's voice still sharp, still defiant, still alive. Together they lingered, even as time carried them farther away. And in the silence of that stillness, one hears the faint hum of recitation, soft and low, as though memory itself were chanting their verses, unwilling to let them vanish. The earth is still, the grave closed, yet the hum continues, soft, almost inaudible, drifting like the sound of prayer through the night. And it is upon that hum that the story turns, for in it lies not only loss, but endurance. For Wallada, older now, continued to write. Her voice softened yet unbroken, her words carrying the pain of memory but also the strength of survival. The faint hum of recitation drifted through the night, like a thread of sound carried by unseen hands, soft yet persistent, reminding that memory cannot be silenced. In that hum, one might imagine the voice of Wallada herself, older now, her tones lower, steadier, less eager to dazzle, yet still alive with fire. Her later poetry, though fewer fragments remain, reveals a voice tempered by years, softened by solitude, yet never subdued. She had known passion and betrayal, laughter and scorn, companionship and loneliness, and all these lived within her verses. The sharp wit that once mocked Ibn Zaydun now gave way to reflection, yet its edge had not dulled completely. Her words could still wound, but they also carried tenderness, sorrow, and the quiet dignity of endurance. One imagines her seated in the lamplight, pen in hand, parchment spread upon a low table, the air heavy with silence, save for the faint scratching of ink. The candle flickers, the shadows shift, and she composes not for a lover, not for rivals, not for the crowded salons of her youth, but for herself, for memory, for the endurance of her name. Her verses in this time speak of pain, but also of defiance, of aging, but also of persistence. She writes of her own independence with the same pride as always, yet with a touch of melancholy now, as if to remind herself that even freedom carries loneliness. And in this balance between strength and sorrow lies the truth of her later years. Her voice, though quieter, was still clear. She spoke of the past without apology, of her scandal without regret. She had walked unveiled, she had loved as she wished, she had hosted salons that defied custom, and she did not repent. If she felt sorrow, it was not for what she had done, but for what had been lost. The sweetness of love turned bitter, the brilliance of Córdoba fading into ruin, the companions whose laughter echoed too long before silence reclaimed them. She was no longer the fiery girl who embroidered her defiance upon silk, but she remained the same spirit, unyielding in her refusal to bow. In her later poetry, there are hints of mortality, of the awareness that life itself flickers like a candle. That time cannot be defied. Yet even in acknowledging this, she did not surrender. Her words remained sharp against the inevitability of death, her voice refusing to vanish into silence. I am still here, her verses seem to say. I still speak, I still defy, I still endure. And indeed, she did endure, her voice carrying through the ruins of Córdoba, through the silence of solitude, through the weight of memory, into the centuries beyond her. The listeners of her time, fewer now, must have felt the poignancy of her verses more deeply than in youth. When she was young, her words shocked. When she was older, they moved. There is a power in the voice of one who has lived fully, who has known joy and loss, who speaks not from theory but from experience. Her verses of later life carried that weight, that authenticity. They were not merely clever, not merely sharp. They were true. And truth, even spoken softly, carries farther than wit, shouted loudly. Her city, meanwhile, grew quieter, dimmer. Córdoba, once the crown of al-Andalus, now stood in decline. Its walls weakened, its palaces emptied. Scholars departed, soldiers wavered, rulers changed. And amid this decline, Wallada's voice became a kind of echo of what once had been, a reminder that brilliance does not vanish even when the structures that housed it fall. She was a living memory of Córdoba's golden age, and her later poetry carried the weight of both personal and civic loss. To speak of her own solitude was to speak also of her city's solitude, abandoned by its glory, left to crumble while others rose. Perhaps this is why her later words remain so haunting. They are not only the words of a woman, they are the words of a city, of an era. In her voice, we hear the fading of Andalusian splendor, the sorrow of a world once radiant, now dimmed. And yet, as always, she turned sorrow into defiance. Her words did not weep, they declared. They did not beg, they proclaimed. Even when softened by pain, her poetry carried the same thread that had defined her from youth. I am myself, and no one will silence me. One sees her in imagination, older now, her hair touched with silver, her face lined by time, yet her eyes still bright, still piercing. She recites her verses softly to those few who gather still, and they listen with reverence, knowing they are in the presence of legend. Perhaps they whisper her words later in markets, as once they did, but now with respect more than scandal. For scandal fades, but dignity remains. And Wallada, in her later years, seemed to embody both, still scandalous in memory, but dignified in her endurance. The hum of recitation drifts on, soft but insistent, as though carried by the air itself. It mingles with the faint sound of the city outside, quieter now, its streets emptier, its markets less crowded. The decline of Córdoba seems to hum along with her voice, the two indistinguishable, both fading yet refusing to vanish completely. Her poetry, softened yet sharp, becomes the last song of a fading city, the last light of a dimming flame. The verses fade into memory, recited softly, then softer still, until they are no longer heard but only felt, like a vibration within the heart. And as they fade, another image rises, the broken arches of Córdoba, shadows stretching beneath them, the ruins of beauty that once stood proud, now silent witnesses to both a city's fall and a woman's enduring presence. The broken arches stood against the sky, fragments of beauty carved in stone, their curves incomplete yet still graceful. Shadows gathered beneath them, stretching long across the ground as the sun lowered, as though the city itself were bowing under the weight of time. Córdoba, once a jewel of light, now wore the garments of ruin. Its palaces, once alive with music and debate, echoed only with emptiness. Its markets, once crowded with merchants from every shore, now thinned, the voices subdued. Its mosques still called to prayer, but their grandeur was diminished, the sound carrying less triumph, more sorrow. And in those ruins, in those shadows, the figure of Wallada seemed mirrored. For she, too, was once radiant with youth and scandal, bold in defiance, feared and adored in equal measure. And now she, too, stood within decline, her radiance tempered by years, her brilliance shadowed by solitude, her presence less dazzling, yet no less unforgettable. The arches bore witness to the passing of empires as she bore witness to the passing of her own age. Each crack in the stone was a memory of greatness lost, as each line upon her face was a mark of passion lived. She walked beneath those arches, perhaps, older now, her steps slower, her gaze steady, carrying within her the memory of what once was. Did she look upon them with sorrow, as one who mourns not only a city but herself? Or did she look upon them with pride, recognizing in their persistence the same refusal to vanish that she herself embodied? For ruins, though broken, endure, and Wallada, though aged, endured. In this, they were the same. Her house, too, bore signs of time, the cushions worn, the walls faded, the courtyards less tended. The fountains still murmured, but with less vigor, their waters clouded by neglect. Yet still she remained within them, a figure of memory and defiance. Guests came rarely now, but when they did, they came as to a relic, a living monument. They looked upon her with reverence, for she was not only Wallada, the scandalous woman, but also Wallada, the last flame of Córdoba's golden age. In her presence, they felt history itself, as if speaking with her was to touch a world already vanishing. She must have felt their gaze, must have understood what she had become, not merely a woman but a symbol, not merely a poet, but a legend. And yet, within her solitude, she was still human, still a woman who remembered blossoms and laughter, who felt sorrow in silence, who watched the city crumble with the same helplessness that she watched her own body age. The city's decline pressed upon her, heavy as dusk. The great caliphal library, once filled with countless volumes, had been looted, its treasures scattered. The learning that had shone so brightly was now dimmed, scholars departing for safer courts. The palaces of Madinat al-Zahra, once gleaming, had been abandoned to ruin, their marble pillaged, their gardens choked with weeds. Wallada must have remembered them in their glory, must have walked their colonnades in youth, must have seen their fountains sparkle. To see them broken was to see her own memories broken, to feel her own life mirrored in the ruins of stone. Her poetry, too, bore this weight, her later verses tinged with the sorrow of decline, aware not only of her own mortality but of the mortality of her world. And yet, even amid ruin, beauty persisted. The arches, though broken, were still graceful. The courtyards, though neglected, still smelled of jasmine when the wind stirred. The river, though carrying dust, still shimmered beneath the moon. And Wallada, though older, though shadowed by solitude, still carried her dignity, still carried her defiance. She did not hide, she did not repent, she did not fade quietly. Like the arches, she remained, a fragment of brilliance, a reminder of what once was, a symbol of beauty that refuses to be erased. Perhaps she felt kinship with the city itself. Both had been bold, both had scandalized, both had endured betrayal and decline. Both had been loved and envied, admired and ridiculed. And both, though diminished, remained unforgettable. Oh, Córdoba would never again be what it had been, but it would never be forgotten. And Wallada, though her salons were quiet, though her lovers were gone, though her voice was softer, would never be forgotten either. In this kinship lay a kind of solace, that she was not alone in her decline, that her city declined with her, that together they carried memory into the future. One imagines her standing beneath the broken arches, her veil absent still, her hair silver in the fading light. She gazes upward at the incomplete curve, at the stone fractured but not fallen. She breathes deeply, inhaling the scent of dust and jasmine mingled. Perhaps she recites softly, her voice carrying against the stone, echoing faintly, as though the city itself were listening. Her words join the murmurs of the river, the whispers of wind through ruins, the silence of empty courtyards. In that moment, she is not only a woman, but the voice of a city, the echo of an age, the last defiance of beauty against decay. The arches cast their shadows long into the night, and beneath them, she walks slowly back into her solitude. The city sleeps, uneasy, fragile, haunted by decline, and within her chamber she lights once more the candle, its flame trembling against the draught. The broken arches linger in her mind, their image etched into her verses, their ruin mirrored in her own endurance. The candle flickers, and she sits beside it, her eyes steady, her pen moving across parchment. For even as the city crumbles, her words endure. And words, unlike stone, do not crack. They live, they travel, they survive. The arches remain in silence, their shadows deep, their beauty broken but not gone. And from beneath them rises another image, darker still. The extinguishing of a lamp, the final light vanishing, leaving only the weight of darkness, as if life itself had been swallowed whole. The lamp was extinguished, its light swallowed by the dark, leaving behind only the faint scent of smoke curling upward, a ghost of fire fading into nothing. So too did Wallada's life come to its close in the year 1091, just as Córdoba itself fell into the hands of the Almoravids. The extinguishing of her flame and the extinguishing of her city's glory became one event, intertwined, inseparable, as if fate had bound the woman and the city together from the beginning, ensuring that neither would outlive the other by long. She had entered the world in a palace of uncertain power. She had lived through decline and betrayal, and she left the world as her city was overtaken. Its independence ended, its memory consigned to ruin. What was her passing like? The chronicles tell us little. No detail survives of her final moments, no record of who stood beside her, of what words she last spoke, of whether she gazed upon the candle or upon the night sky. We are left to imagine. Perhaps she died quietly, her breath slipping away as softly as smoke from a snuffed flame. Perhaps she left with dignity, her pride intact to the last, her eyes still fierce even as her body faltered. Perhaps she felt sorrow at leaving a city so broken, or perhaps she felt relief that her own life would not continue into its further ruin. Death is always veiled, its face hidden, its manner secret. Yet in her death there is a kind of poetry, for it came at the same time as Córdoba's final loss, as if the two could not be parted. Outside, the city trembled. The Almoravids, fierce warriors from the desert, marched through its streets, claiming what remained. The people, weary from years of decline, surrendered, their voices hushed, their eyes lowered. The palaces of old were looted, the remnants of grandeur stripped away. The salons where poetry had flourished were silenced, their cushions abandoned, their music stilled. The gardens grew wild, the fountains dried, the libraries scattered. Córdoba was no longer what it had been, no longer the shining jewel of al-Andalus, but a conquered city, its light dimmed. And within this collapse, Wallada's death seemed both fitting and tragic, the closing of her eyes marking also the closing of Córdoba's golden age. What did the people say when they learned of her passing? Did they remember her as scandalous, as shameless, as bold? Did they whisper her verses, mocking and admiring in the same breath? Did they recall her unveiled face, her embroidered robe, her salons of laughter and verse? Or did they fold her into the greater grief of the city, seeing her not as one woman, but as the symbol of all that had been lost? We cannot know, yet history remembers her, and that itself is remarkable. For many died in that year, many were forgotten, many vanished into silence. But Wallada remains, her name spoken, her verses still alive. That is her triumph, her immortality. Her death, like her life, invites reflection. Was she victorious, having lived as she chose, having refused silence, having carved her presence into history? Or was she defeated, having ended in solitude, her lovers gone, her city fallen, her world broken? Perhaps she was both. Perhaps her life was neither victory nor defeat, but simply the truth of a woman who dared to live fully, who dared to scandalize, who dared to love and to scorn. The extinguishing of her lamp does not answer the question. It leaves it open, lingering like smoke in the air. The city she left behind bore her memory as it bore its own ruins. The arches still stood, though broken. The courtyard still smelled of jasmine, though choked with dust. The river still flowed, though slower, heavier, as though burdened by sorrow. And in those ruins her presence lingered, a ghost of laughter, a whisper of verses, a shadow of defiance. For a city is shaped not only by its rulers and its soldiers, but by its poets, its lovers, its scandalous souls. Córdoba carried her still, even in ruin, as long as voices recited her words. Perhaps in her final days she felt the closeness of death not as terror, but as inevitability, the last verse of a long poem, the final note of a fading song. She had lived in scandal, she had lived in pride, she had lived in sorrow, and now she would die in silence. Yet silence could not contain her, for her words had already escaped into the world, carried on lips, copied on parchment, whispered in memory. Even as her body lay still, her voice continued, as it continues still. This is the strange power of poetry. It defies death. It endures beyond decline. It remains when lamps are extinguished and cities fall. The lamp is dark now, its smoke dissipated, its flame gone. But in the darkness, memory glows, faint but unquenchable. Wallada's life, like her city, has ended. Yet both remain immortal, not in stone, not in power, but in words, in verses, in the echo of scandal that refuses to be silenced. And in this immortality we find not sorrow but a kind of peace. For though lamps are extinguished, the light they once gave is not forgotten. The darkness lingers deep and heavy, pressing upon the city and upon memory alike. And within that darkness a final image rises. Not ruin, not decline, not sorrow, but a legacy. A voice remembered, a presence enduring, a woman whose defiance outlived her death. The story turns now to legacy, to the immortality of words, to the way scandal becomes memory, and memory becomes legend. The darkness lingered deep and heavy, swallowing the last glow of the extinguished lamp, yet within it memory glimmered, faint but steady, like embers that refuse to die. For death had closed upon Wallada, and Córdoba had fallen into ruin. but neither could erase the echo of her presence. She lived on in verse, in scandal, in the whispers of those who could not forget her. Legacy is a strange thing. It is not always shaped by greatness of rule, nor by riches amassed, nor by armies commanded. Sometimes it is shaped by defiance, by words spoken when silence was commanded, by a life lived outside of what was permitted. Wallada's legacy was such a one, woven of poetry, sharpened by scandal, softened by sorrow, enduring because it could not be confined. Her verses survive in fragments, like shards of pottery unearthed from the earth, broken yet beautiful, incomplete yet sufficient to reveal the whole. They tell of love embraced, of betrayal endured, of scorn declared, of pride preserved. They reveal a woman who refused to hide, who claimed her own body, her own words, her own choices, at a time when women were expected to be silent shadows. To read them is to hear her voice still, centuries after her death, whispering and mocking, laughing and lamenting. Her poetry is not only literature, it is survival, it is memory. It is the proof that she lived and that she mattered. Her name has endured alongside the greatest poets of al-Andalus, yet she stands apart from them. For while many wrote of women, she wrote as a woman. While many used women as symbols of beauty or longing, she herself became the voice of beauty and longing, of ridicule and pride. She inverted the roles, she seized the pen, she made herself subject rather than object. And this, more than her scandal, more than her defiance, is what makes her unforgettable. She was not spoken about, she spoke. She was not remembered as someone's beloved, she remembered herself. In this, she achieved what few of her time could dream of. She became her own legend. The people of later centuries remembered her as scandalous. Yes, they remembered her as shameless, bold, unveiled, but they also remembered her as brilliant, as a poetess whose words cut like blades, as a figure whose independence defied time. Even in mockery, her immortality was secured. For mockery fades, but memory remains. And Wallada, even ridiculed, was remembered more than many who lived quietly and obeyed. To be scandalous is to risk being hated, but it is also to ensure one is not forgotten. She chose this knowingly, and history answered by keeping her alive. Her legacy is also bound to her city. Just as Córdoba is remembered not only for its rulers but for its scholars, poets, and artists, so too is Wallada remembered not only for her life, but as a symbol of Córdoba itself, radiant in its golden age, scandalous in its defiance, tragic in its decline. To speak her name is to remember the city, and to speak of Córdoba is to recall her. They are entwined, as if her life was an echo of the city's, and the city's decline an echo of her own. Both remain immortal in memory, even as their stones and bodies have crumbled. What then is her legacy to us, who live centuries later, who listen to her story not as history but as memory? Perhaps it is the reminder that to live fully is to risk scandal, that to speak truly is to risk ridicule, that to love boldly is to risk betrayal. Yet even with these risks, it is better to live unveiled, to speak, to love, to defy, than to vanish into silence. Wallada's life was not easy, not free of pain, not triumphant in every way, but it was hers. It was lived on her own terms, not those imposed upon her, and that is a legacy worth remembering. As we imagine her now, her voice no longer present, yet her verses still alive, we see not only the woman she was, but the legend she became. The girl in the palace of her father's short reign, the young woman unveiling herself in the streets, her robe embroidered with verses, the hostess of salons, surrounded by poets and laughter, the lover of Ibn Zaydun, sharing blossoms and betrayal, the scornful poetess, mocking him with sharp lines, the older woman, alone yet dignified, writing by candlelight as the city declined, And finally, the woman whose death coincided with the fall of Córdoba, her lamp extinguished as the city's light dimmed. These images do not contradict. They complete one another. They are the many selves of Wallada, woven into a single legacy, each as unforgettable as the other. The darkness deepens, but within it, memory glows. Her verses are still recited, her story still told, her name still spoken. She is not a shadow. She is a flame carried forward, lighting paths for those who come after. For every woman who dares to speak when silence is expected, for every poet who dares to write truth rather than flattery, for every soul who chooses freedom over obedience, Wallada's spirit endures. She has become timeless, not because she was perfect, but because she was human, brilliant, flawed, defiant, unforgettable. And so her story dissolves into timeless memory, into the network of voices that keep the past alive. She, the scandalous poet princess of Córdoba, remains with us still, a whisper in the jasmine-scented air, a verse embroidered in golden thread, a flame flickering against the dark. Her life asks us not to judge, but to remember, not to answer the questions of worth and cost, but to hold them in our hearts, unresolved, as she held them in hers. And in this holding, she lives on, across centuries, across silence, across darkness. The embers glow faintly, refusing to die. The verses hum softly, refusing to fade. And as the story closes, we find ourselves not at an ending, but at a continuation, for memory does not end. It lingers, it recites, it breathes. Wallada remains.